Okay, my name is Hiroshi Fukurai. I'm a professor of sociology and legal studies. I'm going to talk about a kind of continuation of what Liz talked about toward the end, about SNCC and also John Lewis. And there was a significant connections between UC Santa Cruz with Black activism. And many of those histories somehow being hidden under the surface. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is going to talk about how that John Lewis, who became very prominent as the chairperson of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is known as SNCC, has a deep connection to this university. And it's quite important. So let me talk maybe 5 minutes, and then I will probably cut off toward the end so that I can respond to the questions. So to understand the UC Santa Cruz historical connection to the revolutionary groups of Black activists, including John Lewis, who was a SNCC, and to another prominent Black political organization called Black Panther Party, which was co-founded by Huey Newton, who attended UC Santa Cruz for both undergraduate and graduate education, completing his bachelor's in 1974 and PhD in 1980 in the history of consciousness. It is also equally important to recognize another African American activist by the name of Kathleen Neal. And she was a SNCC member. And she worked with John Lewis as well, especially in the headquarters in New York, in Atlanta. She was sent to Oakland to lay out the expansive organizational structure of Black Panther Party. And Kathleen Neal's task at the Black Panther Party was to provide logistical support to this young Black organization in Oakland, which was created right after the, as you know, infamous assassination of Malcolm X in 1965. And she first created the position of communication secretary, published pamphlets, and became the spokesperson for the Black Panther Party. She applied her organizational knowledge to help with the broad expansion of this revolutionary Black activism, leading the establishment of branch offices and chapters in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and other major US cities. In her memoir, Kathleen Neal said, quote, "Everything I learned in SNCC, I took with me into the fledgling Black Panther Party," unquote. She became the first woman to join the Panthers Central Committee, and by 1969, 2/3 of Black Panther Party members were women. Kathleen Neal had witnessed the groundbreaking work of Ella Baker, African-American grassroots organizer, who had helped create many prominent civil rights organizations, including SNCC and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, whose members included Fannie Lou Hamer, who had been politicized when she first attended a SNCC meeting at the age of 44. Ella Baker also participated in the Free Angela campaign in the beginning of the 1970s to give support to Angela Davis, who was a prominent Black Panther and the Communist Party member, indicted for murder, imprisoned, and later acquitted by the jury. And Kathleen Neal Cleaver, as she was known after her marriage to Eldridge Cleaver, Black Panther, became active in the international campaign against racism and US imperialism. She went to Africa and opened the international section of the Black Panther Party in Algiers, the capital of Algeria. She and other Black Panther Party members also traveled to North Korea to fight against US imperialism in Asia and beyond. And Mumia Abu-Jamal joined the Black Panther Party at the age of 15 and came to Oakland and worked in the Ministry of Information led by Eldridge Cleaver. He wrote a book called We Want Freedom, A Life in the Black Panther Party, which was published by South End Press 2004, that included commemoration of the significant contributions made by Black Panther women, including Kathleen Neal Cleaver, who wrote the book's introduction. And many Black youth joined the Black Panther Party in the Bay Area, including Danny Glover, who was enrolled at the San Francisco State University and helped organize the first Black student union and helped create the first Black studies programs, not only in the state of California, but in the United States. And UC Santa Cruz has also a strong historical connection with Cuba, which offered political asylum to Black Panthers, including Huey Newton, Kathleen Neal Cleaver, Eldridge Cleaver, Ashata Shaku, and Kwame Trey, that is Stokely Carmichael, who was also SNCC, also a Black Panther Party member. And other people who are being targeted for the neutralization, including outright assassination by the FBI's counterintelligence program known as COINTELPRO. In 1969, two UCLA students who were Black Panthers, Bunchy Carter and Joe Huggins, were assassinated by FBI-paid assets under COINTELPRO at the Campbell Hall on the UCLA campus. Cuba played another crucial role, offering Black students opportunity to attend its medical school in Havana free of charge. This cross-national collaborative arrangement was created by John Lewis and his Black caucus members, including Barbara Lee, who traveled to Cuba and negotiated with Fidel Castro to accept qualified Black students who otherwise could not attend expensive medical school in the United States. And Barbara Lee, the longtime U.S. congressional representative from Oakland, had served as a community volunteer at the Black Panther education program and worked as Bobby Seale's campaign for mayor of Oakland, 1973. Bob Seale is the co-founder, in addition to Huey Newton, of the Black Panther Party. UC Santa Cruz has its own African-American scholar activist, and just like Secretary Weber. Longtime Professor Hardy Frye came to UC Santa Cruz from Yale, 1978, having served field secretary for SNCC in Alabama and Mississippi. Another longtime sociology professor, John Brown Charles, was a member of Friends of SNCC. Sociology professor J. Herman Blake became the first Black faculty in 1966 and wrote a book called Revolutionary Suicide, which was autobiography of Huey Newton. And he founded Oaks College, whose critical tradition had been followed by another critical scholar by the name of history professor David Anthony. And Professor Angela Davis, prominent Black Panther, joined the History of Consciousness in 1984, and later appointed as the UC Presidential Chair in the African American and the Feminist Studies in 1994. There's tremendous connections. There are more, actually. I don't have time to elaborate it. Maybe I can respond to that in Q&A sessions. Thank you. Okay, maybe I can talk a little bit. I think voting is a means. I mean, probably people understand. It's a means, not the ends in itself. And but the voting in the United States has a tremendous meanings because like for example, the voting system in the United States is quite unique, very discriminatory, because you have to pre-register to vote. And if you go to any other democracies, or countries call themselves as democracies, like I'm originally from Japan, born and raised. I was an engineer right away, became sociologist, legal scholar. But Japan and many other countries around the globe, there is no pre-registration. As long as you establish your residency, you are eligible to vote. Okay? It's different here. But the voting is quite important in other dimensions, which is the voting list, which I said the pre-registration, had been used for all kinds of purposes. Political gatherings, and try to create political party, but at the same time, it's used to another democratic function called the jury system, to be selected as jurors. Like for example, if you are resident and pre-registered to vote, then you can be called in to serve as a juror in a criminal case as well as civil case. And many criminal cases, believe it or not, involve crimes with the defendants who are more likely to come from community of color. They to come from the poor communities and so on. And since there is a less voter registration drive among the people who are poor, people of color, and dominantly minorities, I hate to use the word minorities, because Malcolm X never used that, but nonetheless, marginalized communities, people less likely to vote. That means they are less likely to represent themselves in the jury trials in which their community members are actually being tried as a result by the predominantly white juries. So the voting is quite important, not in terms of just try to select and elect residents, the politicians, but also all other functions, especially jury trials, involving police violence, police as defendant. You don't see the people of color representing as a member of the jurors because of the voter registration discrimination continue to go on. So voting is quite important. It's a means, but in the United States, it has a tremendous functions of democracy. People need to vote, register to vote, so they can serve in other democratic functions. 100% agree with what the Secretary whoever said. And we have to be activists. And in responding to Dean Catherine's the question, and I want to go back to what Huey Newton, co-founder of Black Panther, actually, why he got involved in the creation of black activism. Of course, he was reacting to the assassination of his idol, Malcolm X, right, year before he co-founded with Bobby Seale. But he incorporated these educational programs. And so to become Black Panther Party, you have to go through elaborate systems, few weeks of education programs. And there are so many layers in it. But one of them is, he's from Louisiana. His ancestors actually grew up as a sharecropper in the plantations created by not many Europeans, and many of them actually created by French planters. And those French people did not come from France. Many of those people came from Haiti. Those people actually survived the Haitian Revolution, started from 1791. And hundreds of thousands of Haitian slave army soldiers actually defeated French masters, not only once, but twice. And many of those French planters and those masters fled to New Orleans. And that's where you have a French quarters and so on. Then they began to re-establish the plantations there. And so his ancestors grew up in those plantations. So when he came to Oakland, and he said, "This is an urban plantation." That's his word in his memoir. And we are living like sharecroppers. And so what he tried to do was he tried to connect the place of blacks in history, not see themselves as members of gangs fighting against each other, but see that from the evolution of this long history of struggles in North America from 1619, for the first blacks being kidnapped from Africa, brought here as a slave. So for the next 250 years, slavery lasted. And Emancipation Proclamation. Then you have about 10 years of kind of benign period. But after that, there was a great betrayal of 1877. That's the start of Jim Crow, right? There was a convict leasing, the recreation of the same slavery systems. Instead of slave masters, individual slave masters, but those blacks are criminalized and placed into institutions. So those masters actually becoming state institutions. And those slaves actually being lent out to the fields and to the mining industries, or lent out to the steel productions, or the construction of intercontinental railroad. Lasted until 1940, and they have a war. Then you have a full production. So next maybe decade or 2 decades, you have a full employment, including blacks. That's when many of the African Americans, the activists came from 70s, 80s, 90s. Their parents actually benefited out of those labor movement. And they also become part of the unions too. So they began to realize. So what the Huey Newton telling in the initiation, you have to see yourself in the long trajectories of the history of struggle that started more than 400 years ago. And you see yourself in that period. And not only you are always being discriminated, but also you resist it. Like in Haiti, after 13 years of battle against not only French troops twice, they defeated. They also defeated British troops. They tried to advance, take over. They lost it. And also Spanish tried to take over. They defeated. So there's also a resistance and also a resilience. And that he was to bring in those ideas, the history of resistance, into the Black Panther Party. And he tried to create the coalitions, not only with other black gang groups and bringing them into the politicized group, but also extend that, like Fred Hampton, into Chicano groups, Puerto Rico independence movement, into American Indian movement, and also poor white groups, and so on. And it's called rainbow coalitions. And that's why he was targeted, he was assassinated by the API and Chicago. But anyway, so that's Huey Newton. He tried to see yourself in the long history of struggles. And that's why the struggle has to continue. And Black Panther Party was one of those organizations.
So hopefully we have time for one more question from a student online. And it's a question about internationalism. And the student acknowledges that there are authoritarian or even totalitarian regimes in the world, like Russia, China, North Korea. And as a student from Hong Kong, we are fighting for just and democratic government these years by social movements and objecting to the suppressions from the China government. When we see Americans, Burmese, and all those others who are also fighting for their rights, we feel that we are standing together and creating a bigger pressure to all these regimes. So for all the panelists, do you think it's important to stand together with other countries' people and bring an enormous influence that forces our government to respond? And if so, how should we cooperate?
Maybe I should say. Okay, that was a question from the person in Hong Kong, right? And think about the Hong Kong, for example. How the Hong Kong is being created. It created out of the Britain tried to sell opium to Qin Dynasty. Qin Dynasty and people rejected it. Okay, biggest drug trade at that time, starting from 1700s middle into the middle of 1800s. Those are done by Britain. They're the biggest drug trader in the world. They had the millions of acres of field transformed from the arable land in Bangladesh, today's Bangladesh and many other fields, into a poppy field. And as a result, if you look at the Adam Smith Wealth of Nations, it talks about in detail how in a matter of a few decades, the people with the tremendous wealth of the agricultural activities, and they starved to death. Okay, that's create the drugs. And so Britain cannot sell much to China. I mean, they have a silk, they have a tea, they have almost everything. High quality. So they tried to sell opium, and China rejected 1830s, and they lost. And again, then the East India Company got involved and tried to sell it. The 15, 20 years later, China lost again. As a result, Hong Kong was taken and a few other ports. And so since then, the Hong Kong became colony of Britain until 1997. There was no single election who represent that island, the territories. And since Britain left, after its dictatorial rule, without any democratic participation of the people, even the Hong Kongers, unless you have money, you cannot become a citizen in Britain. There are strict regulations about citizenship imposed on Hong Kongers. Okay. So now Britain is saying the Hong Kong people are suffering from anti-democratic regime. It's so hypocritical. And, that's typical of Britain, divide and conquer and lie. And that's why they have one of the most effective intelligence agencies, MI5, MI6, James Bond, and so on. So I would say that definitely there is the transitions in Hong Kong. But I think we need to really see it from the historical perspective, not just taking the matters out of context, just like importance of history, like Huey Newton, Black Panther education program. You have to see it in the trajectory of the histories and evaluate your position in it. And if you think it's important to have an international connections alliance, then do it on that understanding. Okay. So Hong Kong has a lot to go in building international alliance.